In this lesson, we're going to animate a camera to bring our scene to life. Okay, so let's start out by adding that camera to our timeline. So I'm just going to go up here to Layer, make sure I'm selected inside of my composition window there. Layer, New Camera, and we'll just use the default settings for that camera for now. And I want to go ahead and just set a couple keyframes at the beginning of my composition for the settings that our camera is just starting out with right there. But before I set any keyframes, I'm going to go into my composition settings and just kind of tweak a few things to get this a little bit closer to the length that we want to animate here, because 30 seconds is a little bit too long. So we'll come up here to composition settings, and let's just change this to about 7 seconds right there. And I also want to change my frame rate to 24 frames per second. It's defaulting to 29.97 right now, and that's going to give us a little bit too big of a file size, and anything less than 24 frames per second is going to look a little bit choppy. So we're just going to compromise here in the middle with 24 frames per second. It's going to give us a filmic look too, which is kind of what we're going for with this sort of a scene. So I'm okay with these settings now. So let's go ahead and set our first keyframes on our camera. So I want to make sure that I'm keying the point of interest as well as the position. If I'm just keying the position, then I would probably only be using my Z track tool for my camera and my orbit camera tool. But if I want to be able to track in the X and Y position, then I'm going to need that point of interest key. So let's go ahead and do that now before we cause any problems by using different tools. And that's just kind of a pitfall that some people run into when they first start animating a camera in After Effects. So we have that orbit camera tool that I was talking about. Then we have the track XY camera tool and the track Z camera tool. And these are all combined inside of the unified camera tool. So we're going to be using that. And the unified camera tool can be controlled to kind of toggle between those different tools if you have a 3-button mouse. So a left click is going to give you the orbit camera tool. And we see that if I click and drag around my scene, we can start to really see that depth that we've created with our layers just by pushing those backwards in Z space. So let's go ahead and kind of get an interesting composition here by sort of orbiting this around and changing the angle of our camera. Maybe something like that, where we're kind of looking down a little bit more than we were before. Now I want to be careful not to look too far down, because then I start to get these kind of white areas in between my layers. So we'll be careful not to orbit too low. And then also, just to kind of zoom in so I'm not losing too much of my water right there, I can use the track Z tool, which is the right click. So with that held down, I can just start to drag, and that's going to zoom my camera in. So maybe something like that could work. Now maybe I don't actually want to zoom in and completely lose all of my water. So I could now use my XY track tool, which is just going to be pushing in the wheel on your mouse. And now you can kind of grab the whole thing and move that around like that. So I'm just going to move this up a little bit so I can still see the water at the bottom of my scene. And now let's just watch a RAM preview of this to kind of see what we've created with our keyframes. So to start off a RAM preview, I'm going to hit the 0 key on my number pad. And my number pad is the numbers on the right side of my keyboard, not the ones along the top. So you want to make sure you're working with a full keyboard to use that RAM preview option. So that's pretty interesting right there. Now these keyframes are a little bit too close together, so I'm just going to drag these all the way to the end of my composition. So now I'll get a really slow, gradual kind of zoom and pan into my scene here. And you could go in and readjust this if you want to. Maybe you don't want to zoom in quite so far, so you could hold down the right button of your mouse, and maybe you want to orbit a little bit less or more. Maybe you want to orbit in a different direction and see the mountains kind of from this way a little bit. So there's lots of different things you can do. You just want to make sure that you're only setting 2 sets of keyframes for the shot that we're going to be creating. So I have my beginning keyframes and my end keyframes. So that's pretty interesting as that is right there. Now, something that kind of happens here at the end is that we kind of get, it looks like it's maybe slowing down a little bit. So I'm going to double check the interpolation of those keyframes. So I'm going to select all of them. Then we'll go up here to animation and we'll look at the keyframe interpolation. And I'm just going to change that spatial interpolation to linear. Okay, so we see that we got just a little bit of a shift there, and probably there was just something happening that the point of interest and position were having different interpolations. So that was starting to look a little bit strange towards the end. It wasn't consistent. So that's a little bit better there. And now something you can do if you want is kind of start to go in and tweak your layers a little bit now that you have your camera position set. So I'm going to grab my selection tool, and I feel like this layer here, the hills layer, the close hills layer that we created, is maybe a little bit too big. We may have scaled that up too much. So I can grab the scale property just by hitting the S key with that close hills layer selected, and then just scale that down a little bit and kind of reposition it in my scene. And I want to make sure that I'm still overlapping with my water layer. But now I just get a little bit more detail, maybe see a little bit more of that dock as I'm zooming in. And also my hills cabin layer is probably a little bit too big as well. So I'm going to do the same thing for that one, just scale it down a little bit so I get some more detail. And then maybe move that down just a bit there because I have quite a bit of room between that and the large mountain layer in the background. Okay, so I'm scrubbing through that, and that is looking pretty good for our camera movement. Okay, so in this lesson, we learned that animating our camera is a great way for us to show off the depth that we've created between our layers and really make our scene feel like it has some realistic distance.